Just because of his skin color and quiet demeanor, Dante Graves was immediately subjected to a contemptuous kick by police officer Brent Rawlins, right in the middle of a crowded courtroom. Dante's knee hit the floor while Rawlins coldly spat out bitter words, his eyes indifferent, as if he were kicking away a piece of garbage. But what Rawlins didn't know was that the man in front of him had once been a legendary Navy SEAL, specialized in hunting down some of the world's most dangerous criminals. The question is, where you live, what punishment awaits those who think they have the right to crush others, assuming they'll stay silent forever? The door opened without sound, like it had no reason to protest. A man stepped inside, skin the color of sun-worn mahogany, shoulders level, eyes unreadable. His shirt was plain, a dusty blue t-shirt with one shoulder seam tugged just slightly from age. His jeans were worn to that pale edge between grit and softness, and his boots, once black tactical, now dulled and frayed at the edges, moved like they remembered terrain most people never would. The courtroom didn't look up, not really. A few eyes flickered his way, caught by the motion, scanned his clothes, and dismissed him. He wasn't dressed like anyone who belonged here. He wasn't loud enough to be trouble, clean enough to be staff, pressed enough to be law. Just another face, just another chair filled. No one asked him who he was. Brent Rawlins, the security officer posted by the coordinator's desk, glanced over. A habitual scan, a reflex. His gaze flicked from the man's boots to the curve of his neck, then away. Into his radio mic he muttered, "Got another one. Probably here to eavesdrop on the verdict or stir something up. You know the type." He didn't speak loud enough to alert the room, but loud enough that anyone within a few feet could hear. The microphone caught it all. Anyway, the man didn't flinch, didn't change pace. He walked past the benches in slow, silent rhythm, like the air resisted him a little less than it should. There was a heaviness in his motion, but not fatigue. It wasn't limp or slouching or injured. It was a memory, not the kind you carry in your head, but in your muscles. He picked the back row, farthest from the bench, just close enough to see every face but not invite any attention. He sat down, slowly, like he'd timed the exact moment his knees would need to bend to avoid the squeak of an old seat. His back curved slightly. His shoulders dropped. His hands, dark and thick-veined, clasped together in front of him, but his eyes didn't lower, didn't blink. They stayed fixed, frozen, on Rawlins. It wasn't an open stare. It wasn't angry or aggressive. It was patient, a quiet, predatory patience. Not the kind that prepares to leap, the kind that's already decided something and is simply waiting for the world to catch up. Rawlins didn't notice. Or maybe he did and just didn't care. He turned back toward the front, jaw working on whatever gum or tobacco chew helped pass his shift. His vest rose and fell with a slow breath, and his left hand played with the loop of his baton clip, as if by instinct. The man's gaze didn't shift. He blinked once, then again. Two slow, thoughtful movements. The only things moving on his face were his eyelids. The rest stayed still, still like steel under cloth. A mask without malice, but one that gave nothing away. In a courtroom filled with murmurs, rustling papers, and the occasional squeal of worn shoes across polished tile, he was quiet in a way that drew in sound instead of making it. He became a pause, a silence that didn't need to shout to be noticed, the kind of presence that, the longer it went unacknowledged, the more certain you were it wasn't just a coincidence. It wasn't anonymity, it was intentional, measured, practiced. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a faint electric tremor. An attorney laughed softly with his assistant in the second row. A woman in a gray pencil skirt and two high heels flipped through a file, as if she'd forgotten what she was looking for halfway through. The bailiff yawned behind a cupped hand. No one looked back again. But the man in the blue shirt didn't move. He sat like someone who knew that stillness had a gravity to it, and he used it deliberately, not to draw attention, but to contain something, like a fuse tucked too far inside a device to see, but you knew it was there. A silence with the shape of an answer, just waiting for the question. Rawlins didn't like silence. His fingers tapped against the back of the clipboard at his side. He stole another glance back toward the benches, then stopped himself halfway. Nothing. Just the usual lineup of court watchers, law students, troublemakers, and bored family members. One more quiet black man in worn jeans. Seen it 100 times, maybe 1,000. Usually came to support their cousins or friends who got themselves into something they couldn't talk their way out of. They came, they glared, they mumbled, and they left. Always left. But there was something in the air now. It wasn't thicker, but it felt like it should be. The room hadn't changed temperature, the walls hadn't moved, but there was a shift, tilt, subtle, imperceptible to anyone not paying the right kind of attention, and the man was. His gaze followed Rollins with the quiet reverence of someone watching a creature in a cage. Not out of fear, but out of memory. His shoulders didn't rise or fall, he didn't lean forward, but his eyes said everything. They said he'd seen Rollins before. Not in this building, not this year, somewhere else. Somewhere without walls. Somewhere where men weren't protected by uniforms or job titles or the sound of their own voice. Somewhere where consequences had no delay and blood dried on sand, not tile. He blinked again, just once. Rollins scratched the side of his nose and turned toward the judge's door. He was used to tension in a courtroom. People lied here. People got caught. People lost things. Money, rights, freedom. Tension was part of the wallpaper. But this wasn't tension. This was present, and it wasn't going away. The judge hadn't arrived yet. The gallery was slowly filling. No one noticed the boots. No one noticed the way his elbows tucked just slightly inside his body, not resting, but coiled, like every inch of him was being measured against a scale no one else could see. Still, he didn't move. He sat as though motion was a luxury, like he had nowhere to be except exactly where he was. Someone sneezed. The woman in heels dropped her pen. A bailiff's chair creaked, but nothing broke the line between his gaze and Rollins's shoulder. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't fear. It was a memory, a slow, quiet archive written not in words, but in muscle fiber and cartilage, and the way pupils dilate when the light shifts. A man who'd seen something and chosen to carry it instead of bury it. A man whose hands had held more than guns, and whose silence was the only armor left that still fit. The room didn't know what had walked in. Not yet. It hadn't figured out the weight shift. It hadn't realized that everything about this man was deliberate, measured, dangerous in the way calm seas can hide shipwrecks just inches beneath. But someone would, and that silence, dense, patient, sharp-edged like a blade never drawn, was the first cut. The silence didn't break. It snapped, not with a shout nor a sudden gasp, but with motion, sharp, deliberate, irrevocable. As the judge's entrance triggered the rustling of papers and the rearrangement of collars, Dante rose to his feet. Not hurried, not hesitant, just vertical, smooth, intentional, like gravity owed him obedience. He stepped into the aisle, a single movement that cut through the routine like a blade slid through soft fruit. Rollins noticed immediately. His body shifted with the muscle memory of control, of interruption, of ownership of space. He moved fast, not out of fear, but out of habit. His voice came like a bark, short, clipped, laced with disdain. "Sit down. Wait to be called." Dante didn't stop. Rollins took a step, now between the aisle and the witness stand. His hand came up, not a gesture of command, but of force. A wall formed from muscle and badge. "I said, sit your ass down." Dante's eyes didn't flicker. No change of pace, no tilt of the chin, no give in the shoulders. He was made of some other material. Something that didn't bend. Something not raised in rooms like this, but hardened by rooms much worse. Rollins pressed forward. His left hand hit Dante's shoulder. An open palm meant to guide, meant to shove. But Dante didn't yield. The movement met resistance like stone under fabric. Rollins' mouth tightened. His right hand joined the first. Now 2 hands on the chest, a firm push. One trained in compliance. Dante didn't so much as lean. His spine was a line of refusal, and Rollins lost patience. He stepped in closer, twisted his body sideways, and with a quick snap of precision, drove his heel into Dante's side. Low, fast, and hard, right at the floating rib, the place that cracks before it bruises. The sound that followed wasn't a grunt or scream. It wasn't even a human sound. It was the slap of flesh against floor and the wooden resonance of bone hitting polished tile. Sharp, loud, brutal. Dante crumpled, not like a man beaten, but like a force redirected. He hit one knee, then one hand, the other arm cradled protectively along his side. His breath came low and slow, but his head didn't dip. His eyes were still on Rollins, not with hate, with precision, like a scanner locked on target, measuring wind speed and trajectory before a bullet is fired. The room froze. No one moved. The judge hadn't raised a gavel. No lawyer stood. The bailiffs flinched, but only in the way people do when they're reminded they're not heroes. The stenographer stared down at her hands. A woman in the second row inhaled sharply and held it, as if even breathing would turn her into a witness. Rollins sneered. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't smart. It was the grin of a dog mistaking dominance for victory. He adjusted his belt with one hand, kicked his heel back into alignment, then looked down at the man he'd put on the floor and spoke with the venom of someone who liked the taste of it. "One more step, and I'll kick your lungs out through your spine." His words weren't shouted. They were spoken low, slow, calculated to carry just far enough. Each syllable dropped like a toothpick laced with arsenic, small, sharp, and designed to pierce the softest places. And he smiled when he said it. Because of Rollins, this was how you maintain order, not through justice, through pressure, through pain. Dante didn't reply, didn't groan, didn't flinch. He pushed up, just a shift of muscle, his fingers pressing against tile, his legs sliding back into place, his body rising an inch without a sound. He wasn't defiant, he wasn't passive, he was inevitable. Rollins lingered over him for a beat longer, waiting for resistance that never came, for fear that never showed. There was no satisfaction in Dante's face, but no defeat either. It was as if Dante didn't believe he'd been struck, or worse, he believed it, but didn't find it worth reacting to. That silence returned. Not the ordinary courtroom silence, the kind born from procedure and paperwork. This was different, tense, airless. A moment stretched so tight it hummed. No one said a word, not the judge, seated and stone-faced, not the attorneys, watching like statues, not the audience, now caught between breath and memory. No objections, no commands, no outrage, just the echo of impact, the ghost of motion still hanging in the air. And in the center of it, Dante, kneeling but not broken, marked but not moved. There's a kind of violence that screams, those claws, demands. Then there's the other kind, the kind that settles into a room like poison in water, invisible, fatal. Dante was the second kind. His silence didn't plead, it didn't accuse, it promised. Rollins stepped back. His boots scuffed the floor as he repositioned himself, like he hadn't just kicked a man in front of a full courtroom and received no reprimand. Like violence was a formality, a checkbox. He stood straighter, turned half away, eyes scanning for cameras, but not lingering. His smirk stayed less certain now, but still carved into place. Dante rose, slowly, with a breath like something ancient unfolding from slumber. He stood tall, not imposing, but absolute, and though he didn't take another step, though he stayed exactly where the kick had left him, the room had already shifted around him, because everyone had seen what happened, and no one had done a thing. The sound of the judge's gavel came late, hollow, like punctuation after a sentence that had already done its damage. "Order in the court," he said, but his voice didn't ring with authority. It fluttered, wavered, as if the balance of power had already moved elsewhere. Dante said nothing. He didn't blink. His chest rose with steady breath, not fast, not wounded, just alive, present, waiting. And Rollins, his fingers flexing just a little at his side, was the only man in that room who didn't want to hear what Dante would say next. But Dante wasn't speaking. not yet, because silence had done enough for now. He didn't speak, didn't flinch, didn't grunt or groan or call for justice. Dante just turned, slowly, like gravity wasn't quite certain how to pull on him. His body pivoted with the stillness of something ancient, not sluggish, not sudden, but precise, measured down to the breath. He rose from the floor with both knees, pushing up on the rhythm of one inhalation, a motion too clean for pain, too fluid for retaliation. His eyes stayed locked forward. They didn't flick toward the judge or the bailiff or the dozen passive faces pressed into silence. No, they were aimed only at one thing, Rollins. Rollins' hand had already moved. Not fast enough. He was reaching for his radio, thumb dragging across the comm button, his mouth already parting to spit out the next command, an order, a lie, a name, something to twist the narrative before it left his hands. But the words never came, because Dante moved. He didn't leap, he didn't roar, he didn't give a warning. He just stepped. One deliberate stride, heel to toe, grounded and silent. His body turned in a compact coil, a rotation so natural it didn't register as violence until it was already happening. His left arm slid under Rollins' right, lifting it like a curtain being drawn. His right arm followed instantly, folding at the elbow, twisting the joint inward with quiet finality. Rollins was halfway through inhaling when Dante's grip reversed, spun him like a hinge, and drove his torso downward in a single, seamless whip. The sound was clean. No struggle, no slapstick flailing, just a crack, dull, thick, and absolute. Rollins' back hit the polished floor like furniture tipping too fast. The wind crushed from his lungs before he had a chance to remember how to scream. His firearm, still holstered on the right hip, broke free in the scuffle, clattering against tile with the metallic ring of something helpless. The echo rang too long. No one moved to retrieve it. Dante didn't rise. He stayed exactly where the force had taken him. One knee down, the other foot planted, spine coiled, locked around Rollins with the ease of a python too bored to hiss. His right arm cradled Rollins' throat, just enough pressure to warn, not to crush. His left hand flattened over Rollins' sternum, pinning him, breathing synchronized like it had been rehearsed in another life. But the eyes, that was what froze the room. Dante's gaze was fixed directly into Rollins, unblinking, unwavering, 2 points of pressure more devastating than any blow. There was no fury in them, no vengeance. What stared back was calculation, stillness, a heartbeat counting down, not up, a clock ticking in reverse. He wasn't performing, he wasn't intimidating, he was remembering. Rollins's face had shifted from rage to confusion to panic in the span of a second, and now it hovered somewhere between humiliation and dread. His legs kicked weakly, instinct without power. His right arm reached for nothing, finding only the air where authority used to be. Dante's grip didn't tighten, it didn't need to. Every inch of his body communicated a singular message. You are no longer in control. The room remained silent. No one screamed. No one called for help. No one stopped the scene. It had become too real, too fast, and now even the walls seemed unsure whether they were still allowed to echo back sound. A chair creaked. Someone dropped a pen. The gavel lay untouched. Rollins tried to speak, but Dante shifted the grip by half an inch, just enough to press into the muscle of the neck where speech gets strangled before sound. Rollins' mouth opened, closed, opened again, a fish stranded on the tile, pinned by a man who had spoken no threats and made no claims. Dante's breath didn't quicken. His body didn't tremble. The silence inside him was absolute, not calm, not numb, just final. His gaze flicked, for the briefest moment, from Rollins' eyes to the pulsing artery in his neck. His pupils didn't dilate. His brow didn't furrow. He was not checking, he was measuring. The room finally remembered it was supposed to exist. Someone stood, a woman, maybe a clerk, but the motion was hesitant, like standing in church too early. Another figure moved toward the bailiff's station, then stopped, unsure if intervening would place them next on the floor. The silence pressed down again. Rollins had always believed that force was power, that volume and speed and sharp commands ruled the room. But now he lay in a chokehold, built not from rage, but precision. precision, not from adrenaline, but mastery. His arms twitched, not in resistance, but because his nervous system couldn't decide whether to panic or surrender. Dante leaned in, just enough for his breath to ghost across Rawlins's cheek. No words, not even a whisper, only presence. It was louder than violence, more terrifying than fury. He could have said something then, anything, a threat, a memory, a name, but he didn't. The absence of speech was the language, and Rawlins understood it now. Dante held the position. Not for show, not for dominance, but because balance matters. Because knowing exactly how much weight to apply before a man passes out is not something you learn in books. It's something learned when life depends on it, and when death is not a stranger, but a former colleague. The gun still lay 3 feet away. No one dared move for it. And then, slowly, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, Dante released. Not all at once. Not theatrically, just enough pressure eased from the throat. The shift in balance released Rawlins' torso, not like a gift, but like letting go of something already broken. Dante pushed back, straightened to a low crouch, and rose in one clean motion, never looking away. Rawlins gasped. The noise was wet, rough, like a man breathing through panic instead of lungs. He rolled halfway to one side, not to stand, but to escape the floor itself. His badge hung crooked on his chest, his hairline damp with sweat that hadn't been there a minute ago. Dante stood, back tall, arms relaxed, the very image of restraint. Not heroic, not aggressive, just controlled. His shirt hung a little loose, one shoulder creased from movement. His breath was steady, and his eyes, those eyes, still locked on Rawlins, now not just as a memory, but as a warning. He didn't need to say, "Don't do it again." He didn't need to say, "You started this." He didn't need to say, "I could have ended it." The room already knew, and Rawlins, he was starting to understand. Rawlins was dragged to his feet, breath still ragged, dignity dangling from the last thread of pretense. His spine bent not from injury, but the kind of humiliation that claws into bone. His jaw clenched, face contorted into a crooked snarl that tried to resemble authority, but couldn't mask the tremble in his fingers. He staggered one step back, eyes wild, looking for support in a room too quiet to offer any. The courtroom had not moved, but the room had shifted, the center of gravity now standing tall just feet away, unmoved, untouched by the scuffle that had reduced a uniform to a puddle. Dante stood straight, no shake in his stance, no visible rise in his breath, shoulders squared, hands at his sides, chest calm, like a man who had done nothing more than adjust a chair. His shirt was torn along the right sleeve, the fabric split in a jagged diagonal rip that seemed almost surgical. Through the gash, something inked caught the light, a series of letters and numbers, etched not for beauty, but for legacy. Not tribal, not abstract, but a history burned into muscle. SEAL Team 5, Red Ops, Somalia. Blackened and bold, stretched along his arm like a scar that refused to fade. It wasn't just a tattoo, it was a record, a marker, a sentence without punctuation. The courtroom didn't gasp, but the silence deepened. People leaned, eyes narrowing, breath halting, not to admire, but to register. That ink wasn't random. It meant something. It carried weight, blood, dust. Missions are buried beneath official reports and sealed folders. It was the kind of mark that didn't ask for respect, took it. Rawlins saw it, and he froze. Half a second, maybe less, but enough for the air between them to thicken, for his jaw to pause mid-snarl, for the corners of his eyes to twitch, not from recognition, but from understanding. He knew what that tattoo meant. Everyone in law enforcement did, or at least pretended they did, at barbecues where stories about the real guys floated around like smoke from cheap cigars. But Rawlins wasn't built to revere anyone. He recoiled instinctively from anything he couldn't dominate. So he lashed. His voice cracked sharply, sharp like a whip pretending to be a sword. "I don't give a damn who you are," he spat, volume cutting the silence like a cheap knife. "In here, I am the law." He stood straighter now, drawing what was left of his authority like a dying flame trying to puff its last smoke. His hands balled into fists, but he didn't move closer, not anymore. Dante's eyes didn't change. No fury, no mockery, just that same relentless focus, as if Rawlins's voice was a distant radio signal barely worth tuning into. Then he spoke. Calm, measured, devastating. Law, he said, voice so quiet it forced the room to lean in, as if volume were beneath him. I once carried a soldier with a shattered femur across the Afghan border under fire, just to keep that law alive. He didn't elaborate. No rank, no medals, no date, just the fact. Delivered without decoration, without a raised voice, without needing validation. Rawlins blinked. Just once. His lips moved again, but nothing came out. There was no comeback, no scoff, no accusation. Not yet. Because what can a man say when someone reminds him that the rule book he abuses was once bought in blood? The tattoo was still visible. The ink hadn't faded, hadn't blurred. It ran down the curve of Dante's bicep like a wound stitched shut with black fire. It didn't beg for attention. It commanded memory. You didn't look at it. You braced against it. It said, I've been where your nightmares come from. It said, I carry more than pain. It said, you are not the first to raise your hand against me, and you won't be remembered any better than the last. Someone in the gallery shifted. Someone else exhaled, but no one spoke. And Rawlins, stripped of control, pride, of certainty, stood in front of a man who had just upended him with less force than memory. Because this wasn't about muscle. It was about knowing exactly how much of yourself is real when everything else is torn away. Dante didn't step forward. He didn't press. He didn't threaten. He didn't need to. Because what spoke louder than his words, louder than Rawlins' shout, louder than the courtroom's muted shock, was the black ink crawling down his arm, untouched by time, untouched by apology. A symbol not of vengeance, but of the kind of duty people like Rawlins only wore on laminated ID cards. The air didn't clear. It settled, heavier, because in that one moment, every person in the room realized something primal. Dante wasn't the one who had to prove himself. Rawlins was, and he had already failed. The ink still lingered in the room like smoke that hadn't been exhaled, and even as Dante's sleeve slipped back down over the mark, no one forgot what they'd seen. No one dared. The judge didn't clear his throat. The attorneys didn't adjust their files, and Rawlins, who had just spat defiance like a snake flaring its hood, said nothing more. The silence, thick and almost sacred, became a corridor. Dante stepped into it. No one called his name, no bailiff gestured, no lawyer asked a question, but he moved toward the witness stand with the weight of something predestined, a man responding not to protocol, but to a promise. Each footstep was a beat, not loud, not dramatic, but finally, as if each movement had been measured long before this room, long before these people, long before this version of justice even knew his name. The judge didn't object. He watched, because there are moments in courtrooms when the system realizes it's not the one holding the gavel. Dante reached the stand and didn't wait for permission. He stood, not hunched, not overeager, just present, eyes forward, hands at his sides. The light caught his cheekbone and the sharp edge of a life worn down by years that never offered rest. He wasn't performing, he wasn't explaining, he was remembering, and that weight alone demanded silence. Then he spoke. "My name is Graves," he said. His voice didn't rise, it didn't echo, but it cut straight through the air like steel wire pulled taut. Team 5, I'm here to testify on behalf of a soldier who didn't make it back, because the man responsible for that is sitting right over there. His hand didn't point, his head didn't tilt, but everyone looked. Every pair of eyes in that room, sharp, dull, cynical, curious, turned toward Rawlins, and Rawlins reacted. "I don't know this man," he shouted, voice cracking through the fragile calm like a bottle thrown against tile. "I've never seen him in my life." But no one looked at him the way they had looked at Dante, because panic is loud. Truth is quieter. Dante didn't answer the outburst. He didn't smirk or flinch or feed the flame. Instead, he reached down and slowly unbuckled the leather satchel slung across his shoulder. The strap creaked, dry with age. He lifted the flap, hands steady, fingers practiced, and pulled out something small, brown, and battered. It wasn't thick, it wasn't bound with anything official. It was a notebook, military issue, corners curled from years of dust and heat, and the front was stained, dark, uneven, unmistakable. Blood dried into the grain of the cover like a final fingerprint. He held it up, just high enough for the courtroom to see it existed. Then he spoke again. Hyden Williams, he said, killed in 2013. He kept this journal during his final deployment. It never made it home. I did. He didn't pass it to the clerk. He didn't hold it out to the judge. He simply placed it on the stand in front of him, like a headstone no one could bury. I gave my word to carry this, he said, because there wasn't anything else left of him. Rollins scoffed, louder this time, pushing up from his seat as if motion could overwrite memory. This is bullshit. What proof does he even have? Dante still didn't turn, still didn't engage. He laid one hand gently over the cover of the journal, not to protect it, but to steady it, as if the story inside still moved. Then he looked forward again, eyes calm, voice low. I'm not here to explain, he said. I'm here because someone had to be. The silence afterward was more than absence. It was mourning. The pages in that journal didn't need to be read aloud. Everyone in the room, from judge to janitor, understood instinctively what they held. Sweat, blood, sand, fear, hope, orders never questioned, wounds never closed. It wasn't just evidence. It was memory incarnate, carried across continents, delivered like a final dispatch. Rollins' lips moved, but nothing came out. He shifted in his seat, hands twitching near the table's edge like a man grasping for a weapon that wasn't there. Because there wasn't a weapon for this. There was only truth. Dante didn't look at him, not once. His eyes remained forward, focused on the invisible line between what had been lost and what had been hidden. He wasn't here to debate guilt. He wasn't here to plead. He was fulfilling the last line in a dying man's memory. The courtroom was still. No one asked questions. No one had to, because this wasn't testimony. It was the burial, and Dante Graves had just laid the first stone. The journal remained on the stand like a wound no one dared dress, but the tremors it unleashed had already crawled beneath the skin of the courtroom. It didn't bleed, it didn't scream, it just sat there, quiet, undeniable, and alive in all the ways Rollins had tried to bury. But guilt never dies easily. It mutates, it lashes back, and Rollins wasn't the type to absorb blame. He was the type to deflect it with the speed of a man who'd built his career behind badges, behind silence, behind polished boots and paperwork that always managed to come back clean. Hours later, in a closed-door session behind the courtroom, his anger resurfaced, not as fury, but as strategy. He's fabricating the whole damn thing, Rollins snapped, pacing in a narrow arc across the polished floor of the internal inquiry room. He's not a real SEAL. It's an act, the whole persona. I want his military file pulled. Every record, every operation, everything. A younger officer, fresh out of probation, still sharp-edged with idealism and unsure when to interrupt, nodded with robotic efficiency. Yes, sir, he said. We'll start with the DoD registry. He tapped into the system with the procedural rhythm of someone who didn't expect a surprise. His fingers flew across the keyboard, the hum of the server punctuated only by Rollins' pacing boots. The search pinged, then it froze, a blank screen for a heartbeat. Then came the result, a simple string of text, centered on a gray background. Clearance Delta Zulu, restricted access, Pentagon only. No name, no birth date, no branch history, no photo, just a digital wall, cold and absolute. The room didn't breathe. The young officer blinked, read the message again, then turned slowly to Rollins. Sir, it's locked. Clearance level, Delta Zulu. His voice faltered at the end, like he wasn't sure how loud to say it. Rollins' face twisted. He leaned over the monitor, squinting as if the screen might change under pressure. That's not possible, he said, voice suddenly brittle. Nobody gets that kind of lockout except... He stopped, because he already knew the exceptions, and Dante Graves had just become one of them. His teeth clicked, his jaw worked, chewing in frustration. "No way a SEAL just lets himself get kicked around like that in public," he spat. "No way." But the certainty was slipping. The uniform wasn't fitting like it used to. Authority, for men like Rollins, was supposed to come with immunity, a shield forged from repetition, routine, and unchecked power. But now, the cracks were showing, not in the system, in him, and everyone around him was beginning to see it. The officer glanced at the screen again, then back at Rollins. "Sir, maybe we shouldn't push further." Rollins spun. "You think he's untouchable? That's what you're saying?" "I'm saying," the younger man replied carefully, "the system just told us to back off." But Rollins didn't back off. He boiled. He marched toward the evidence board, tore down a printout of the court's witness list, slapped it against the wall, and barked, "You think real operators walk into courtrooms without backup? You think a man like that just strolls in and hands out journals like holy scripture?" He needed to believe it was staged. He needed the lie, because the alternative, the truth, would mean that everything Rollins wore, said, and enforced was hollow, and Dante had seen it. Worse, Dante had shown it. The door creaked, and just like that, Dante stepped in, unannounced, uninvited, undeterred. Rollins turned, startled but recovering too fast for comfort. "You think you can just walk in here?" Dante didn't answer. He walked straight to the table. The silence that followed was a vacuum. No one stopped him. No one asked how he got in. No one questioned whether he belonged, because something in his posture made the room smaller, quieter, less sure of its walls. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a photograph, and it wasn't grainy. It wasn't faded. It was crisp, high resolution, unmistakable. He laid it on the table face up, carefully, as if placing a scalpel on a tray. In the image, Rollins, caught in perfect clarity, kneeling on the back of a soldier, a knee jammed against the base of the skull, the victim's face half buried in dirt, one arm bent awkwardly behind, and Rollins, looking straight at the camera, smiling. That smile, it wasn't joy. It was power, ownership, a predator's grin. The room didn't speak. No one had to, because the photo didn't need context, it didn't need captions, it didn't need a timestamp, or an affidavit, or a press release. It was more than proof. It was a revelation. Rollins stared down at it. His mouth opened, but nothing came. His reputation had been built brick by brick. Cases closed, reports signed, arrests made. But the mortar was lies, and now the walls were shifting. Dante leaned in, just a breath closer, and for the first time since he entered that day, he spoke not to the room, not to the system, but to Rollins. Just one word. "Recognize?" It wasn't a question. It was a sentence. Rollins didn't answer, because the con had been called out, and the uniform was no longer enough. The photograph still burned in Rollins' memory, as if it had been branded into the inside of his eyelids. Even hours later, after the doors had shut and the lights dimmed, it hung behind his thoughts like smoke clinging to walls long after the fire. But fires don't stay public forever. Eventually, even shame has to leave the stage, and when it does, it waits in quiet places, in shadowed corners where no microphones reach. That's where Rollins found himself now, just off the main corridor of the courthouse. Walls blank, air stale, footsteps distant. No cameras, no reporters. Just the throb of humiliation is still fresh under his skin. He leaned back against the cold wall, the tension in his spine locked tight as wire, as if posture alone could hold together what was left of his image. Then Dante appeared. No sound, no warning, as presence. He didn't walk in with drama. He didn't announce himself. He simply stepped into view like a shadow rounding a corner, solid, deliberate, undeniable, and in this narrow hallway, with no audience to manipulate and no badge to wave, Rollins didn't get to be the man in charge. He straightened up fast, tried to recover the shape of command in his stance, but the damage wasn't physical. It was surgical. His eyes flicked toward Dante, not in dominance this time, but in confusion that couldn't quite hide the curiosity beneath it. "You could hit me back the second I touched you," Rollins said, voice low, almost conversational, but edged with that familiar venom that always followed when he wasn't holding the upper hand. "But you didn't. You waited. You let me kick you. Why?" Dante didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. That kind of silence, in a place like this, was louder than a threat. When he finally spoke, his voice didn't rise, it didn't tremble. It came slowly, steadily, and stripped of performance. "Because I made a promise," he said, "to my teammate's wife, that I'd never use violence unless I had to. Not for pride, not for ego, only to protect." Rollins tilted his head slightly, lips curling in a crooked smirk. "So that was restraint? You were just, what, playing the monk until I crossed some line?" Dante didn't blink. "You crossed it." Rollins chuckled, a dry, hollow sound with no humor in it. "You think that gets you something? Some moral high ground?" He stepped forward half a pace, trying to test the tension, the way men do when they still think posturing means something. "What, you think you're safe now? You think I won't come back for you?" Dante didn't shift, didn't flinch. He simply nodded. Not slow, not theatrical. Just one sharp dip of the chin. "No," he said, "I don't think I'm safe. I just think next time you won't be so quick to kick anyone else. Not me, not anyone." That was it. No threat, no insult, just a forecast. And in that moment, Rollins finally understood what kind of man he was standing in front of. Not a hero, not a martyr, not a machine, but someone who had chosen patience over pride, and still walked away holding the truth like a loaded weapon he never needed to fire. Dante turned and walked off, leaving nothing behind but air that felt denser than before, like the hallway itself had just witnessed a warning etched in silence. Rollins didn't move, because there was no counter. There was no comeback, just the echo of a voice that didn't shout, didn't fight, didn't need to win out loud, and the sick realization that honor, when it finally explodes, doesn't always leave blood behind. Sometimes it just leaves a man alone with himself. The silence Dante left behind in the hallway still echoed long after his footsteps disappeared, and Rollins, desperate to reclaim a version of himself that no longer fit, did what men like him always do when truth corners them. He went public. The press conference was called under the pretense of clarity, of transparency, but it was staged like theater, with microphones pre-checked, flags at optimal angles, and a row of uniformed officers flanking Rollins to paint a portrait of institutional certainty. Cameras clicked, reporters murmured. Rollins stepped up to the podium, his tie crisp, badge polished, voice dialed into a register of faux gravitas. He didn't waste time. "This is a distraction," he said. "We are witnessing the unraveling of a man with clear psychological instability, a veteran whose trauma has unfortunately translated into aggression and public disruption." He paused, letting the sentence breathe like it meant something. "Mr. Dante Graves is not the hero he pretends to be. He is a danger to due process, a loose cannon trying to undermine the very institutions that once gave him purpose." It was delivered clean, pre-written, laced with legal camouflage. But what Rollins didn't know, what no one in that room could have prepared for, was that Graves was already seated in the third row, silent as ever, waiting. He rose without a rush, not a word spoken, just a motion that cut through the static like a piano note in a vacuum. The room shifted. The press looked. Rollins stopped mid-sentence, brow tightening as if his reality had been ambushed. Dante stepped forward, every movement measured. No urgency, no prelude. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small black case, the kind you don't buy, the kind you receive with hands shaking and hearts pounding. He opened it, revealing the unmistakable gleam of a silver star, the kind given for gallantry in action, for standing where others fall. But this one was different. At its base was a small embedded strip, barely visible unless you knew where to look, a DNA-verified authenticity tag. Military issued, irrefutable. Dante didn't speak. He walked forward, past stunned reporters, past law enforcement officials who'd begun to shift uneasily in their chairs, and placed the case directly in front of Rollins on the podium. The sound it made wasn't loud, just a soft click as the metal met wood. But in the silence that followed, it thundered. Then, without a glance at the man across from him, without a word for the press or the cameras, Dante turned and walked away, disappearing through the same aisle he'd entered, like a ghost leaving behind proof that it had been flesh once. Rollins didn't move. He stared at the metal, at the strip of code glowing faintly beneath the glass, and his fingers twitched. His throat locked. He reached toward it, almost reflexively, then stopped, because he had seen that metal before. Not this one, but one just like it. He had taken one just like it off a dying man. Not in combat, not in battle, but in an alley behind a raid no one recorded, from a soldier who begged for breath and never got it. He hadn't kept the metal, he couldn't, but he remembered the weight, and now that same weight had returned, sanctioned, certified, irrefutable, carried by the one man he had hoped would never crawl out of history. The room didn't clap, no one cheered, the press didn't shout questions. It was as if the entire world had been forced to stop breathing in the presence of something heavier than violence. Proof, not shouted, not posted, just placed. A relic that shattered lies without needing voice. A symbol of courage now sitting like a judgment Rollins could neither hold nor dismiss. And as the cameras turned from the man behind the podium to the space left behind by Dante Graves, Rollins felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not fear, not shame, but recognition. Because no matter how many uniforms he wore, how many podiums he stood behind, how many lives he rewrote, he could never fabricate the weight of honor, forged in blood and returned in silence. The medal still sat on the table in the press room long after Dante had left, untouched, gleaming like a silent indictment no podium could talk over. But medals only echo. It's evidence that strikes the final blow. Days later, in a reopened federal inquiry into the death of specialist Hayden Williams, the forensic report was made public, not through media leaks, not by whistleblowers, but by the system itself, finally cornered by its procedures. Under high magnification analysis, lodged beneath the fingernails of Hayden's right hand was a sliver of woven dark puller fabric, consistent with regulation-issue police uniforms from the very department Rollins served. It wasn't a thread, it wasn't lint, it was torn cloth, blood-soaked, with a trace DNA signature. Positive match. Officer Brent A. Rollins. The finding was read aloud by a forensic analyst with a voice flat as courtroom tile. No emphasis, no moral commentary, just line after line of facts stacked like weights in a vault. Location of sample, depth of embedment, timeline of decomposition, chain of custody. There was no room for interpretation, no place to hide context. It wasn't a debate, it was a blade. Rollins sat through the reading like a man waiting for his name to be called in a room that no longer respected it. His fingers clenched and unclenched on the edge of the table, the tremor subtle but growing. Across from him sat two federal agents and a state investigator, each holding a copy of the report, none looking at him as it was read, because the words did the looking now. When the analyst concluded, silence hovered for exactly 3 seconds. Then came the question, the one Rollins must have known was coming, the one that held no judgment in tone, just precision. Can you explain how your uniform's fabric ended up under the fingernails of a deceased Army specialist whose death report lists no contact with officers present? Rollins opened his mouth. He blinked. Then came the start of the excuse, thin, too thin, brittle before it even left his throat. It must have been during the restraint. A struggle. There was confusion. I might have brushed. He stopped, because the look across the table didn't ask for storytelling. They had already read the timeline. They had the report from that day. They knew there had been no documented struggle, no record of resistance, no bruises on Hayden's wrists, no taser deployment, nothing except a crushed larynx, a hemorrhaged eye socket, and now this. Dante wasn't in the room. He didn't have to be. His words had already been logged, transcribed, and archived. And when a federal official asked if any witnesses had previously submitted statements, one name was pulled. The clerk scrawled, "Read." The statement was brief, 2 lines, no embellishment, just a summary of what Dante Graves had said in court, word for word. And who died believing in the law. But the law wore a uniform, smiled, and choked him to death. There was no rebuttal for that, because rebuttal requires oxygen, and Hayden Williams had run out. Rollins looked down at his own hands, suddenly more visible than they'd ever been. Hands that used to sign reports, snap on cuffs, point fingers across interrogation rooms. Hands that, once upon a time, gripped the back of a soldier's neck and pushed until the struggle stopped. And now those hands sat still, exposed not by speculation, but by the microscopic truth left behind by a man who had scratched for breath in his final seconds and pulled down the fabric of the lie with him. No one shouted. No one cried. This wasn't drama. It was data. It was the weight of precision finally doing what outrage never could, removing all room for doubt. And in that kind of room, Brent Rollins wasn't a cop. He wasn't even a man defending himself. He was evidence. The report had been read, the forensics filed, the chain of evidence sealed and submitted, and still no one in the room dared to speak above a whisper. Brent Rollins sat at the far end of the courtroom, eyes fixed downward, hands folded not in composure but in the futile grip of a man watching the weight of truth grind slowly across the floor like steel, dragging against stone. His gun sat on the table beside him, holstered and silent, its symbolic presence now little more than metal and policy. The badge next to it gleamed dully under courtroom lighting, a useless reflection of authority he no longer possessed. Then came the final moment, the one no uniform, no denial, no procedure could interrupt. Dante R. Graves stood. He wasn't summoned. He didn't need to be. The judge looked up, met his eyes, and gave the briefest nod, not approval, not invitation, but recognition. Graves walked to the center of the room with a step too precise to be theatrical, too steady to be aggressive. He held a folded sheet of paper in one hand, uncreased, unbent, pristine, like it had never been clenched in anger or sweat. The paper was not heavy, but the silence around it was. It felt like the entire courtroom leaned slightly forward, as if gravity itself had shifted to where he stood. Graves didn't look around. He didn't scan faces for sympathy or support. His attention stayed fixed on the judge, on the law, on the same institution that had failed one man and tried to erase another. And then he began to read. The room dared to speak above a whisper. Brent Rollins sat at the far end of the courtroom, eyes fixed downward, hands folded not in composure but in the futile grip of a man watching the weight of truth grind slowly across the floor like steel dragging against stone. His gun sat on the table beside him, holstered and silent, its symbolic presence now little more than metal and policy. The badge next to it gleamed dully under courtroom lighting, a useless reflection of authority he no longer possessed. Then came the final moment, the one no uniform, no denial, no procedure could interrupt. Dante R. Graves stood. He wasn't summoned. He didn't need to be. The judge looked up, met his eyes, and gave the briefest nod. Not approval, not invitation, but recognition. Graves walked to the center of the room with a step too precise to be theatrical, too steady to be aggressive. He held a folded sheet of paper in one hand, uncreased, unbent, pristine, like it had never been clenched in anger or sweat. He unfolded it without fanfare, the paper making no sound, but the anticipation crackled in the silence like static electricity on skin. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't glance at anyone in the room. He simply spoke, and the room bent around the weight of each word. There was no prologue, no disclaimer, no need for dramatic tone. His voice wasn't loud, but it was final, downward, hands folded not in composure but in the futile grip of a man watching the weight of truth grind slowly across the floor like steel dragging against stone. His gun sat on the table beside him, holstered and silent, its symbolic presence now little more than metal and policy. The badge next to it gleamed dully under courtroom lighting, a useless reflection of authority he no longer possessed. Then came the final moment, the one no uniform, no denial, no procedure could interrupt. Dante R. Graves stood. He wasn't summoned. He didn't need to be. The judge looked up, met his eyes, and gave the briefest nod. Not approval, not invitation, but recognition. Graves walked to the center of the room with a step too precise to be theatrical, too steady to be aggressive. He held a folded sheet of paper in one hand, uncreased, unbent, pristine, like it had never been clenched in anger or sweat. The report had been read, the forensics filed, the chain of evidence sealed and submitted, and still no one in the room dared to speak above a whisper. Graves' voice came without tremor, but each syllable carried a force that needed no rise in volume. "Some men stand behind words," he said, "others behind laws. But some men don't stand behind anything. They stand because others fell." His hand, still holding the statement, remained steady at his side, as if even the words weren't meant to be exalted, only delivered. The silence that followed wasn't permission, it was confirmation. No rebuttal was offered, because none existed. Slowly across the floor like steel dragging against stone. His gun sat on the table beside him, holstered and silent, its symbolic presence now little more than metal and policy. The badge next to it gleamed dully under courtroom lighting, a useless reflection of authority he no longer possessed. Then came the final moment, the one no uniform, no denial, no procedure could interrupt. Dante R. Graves stood. He wasn't summoned, he didn't need to be. The judge looked up, met his eyes, and gave the briefest nod. Not approval, not invitation, but recognition. Graves walked to the center of the room with a step too precise to be theatrical, too steady to be aggressive. If he passed the steps, he was meant to stop silent and to give his testimony, and, especially, he held a folded sheet of paper in one hand, uncreased, unbent, pristine, like it had never been clenched in anger or sweat. The report had been read, the forensics filed, the chain of evidence sealed and submitted, and still no one in the room dared to speak above a whisper. Brent Rollins sat at the far end of the courtroom, eyes locked to the space just beyond the barrel of his legacy. He didn't reach for the weapon, he didn't touch the badge, he didn't speak, because in a room built to measure guilt in evidence, he had finally encountered something heavier than fact. Someone who never needed to raise his voice to be heard. Graves folded the paper again, slipped it back into his pocket, and turned without hesitation. There were no handshakes, no salutes, no applause. He walked toward the exit with the same composure he had carried into war, into grief, into silence. And the room, for the first time, seemed to understand it wasn't just watching a man leave, it was watching a reckoning end. Some names aren't written in ink, they are carved by what they refuse to say. And some men never need to swear because the lives they live make the oath for them. And the silence had settled in Rollins' apartment like a thick fog. No television, no music, just the low hum of the refrigerator and the slow ticking of a crooked wall clock that seemed determined to stall time itself. He sat on the edge of his bed, fully clothed in yesterday's uniform pants, white shirt, untucked and stained near the waist. The badge that once defined him sat on the dresser, its edges dulled, its glow dimmed. He had been suspended, pending further investigation, as the official email had put it. But it wasn't the loss of duty that weighed on his chest like a concrete slab. It was the taste of something he couldn't name, a metallic bitterness, part fear, part fury, part something far colder. That night, sleep did not come. It dragged him under, but not into rest, into something far darker. In the dream, he stood back in uniform, boots hitting desert sand, the wind carving angry lines across his face like punishment. The air smelled of sweat and metal. He held his service weapon steady, scanning the horizon. Then the landscape began to bend, buildings fading into dunes, his teammates vanishing into vapor, until only one figure remained. Dante. He walked forward, alone, without armor, without haste, wearing nothing but a blood-soaked combat uniform ripped at the seams. Sand clung to the dried patches of crimson like ash. His footsteps made no sound. There was no radio chatter, no gunfire, just that eerie void of noise that made the world feel posthumous. Rawlins tried to raise his weapon. It jammed. He tried to move his feet. They sank deeper into the dirt. Dante kept walking. Closer, close. When Dante finally stopped, there was no accusation in his eyes, only a quiet vacancy that suggested he'd seen too much to bother speaking. Then, silently, he raised one hand and placed it against Rawlins' chest, right over the heart. Except there was none, just a cold, hollow gap, as if someone had scooped it out and left nothing in its place. The contact burned like dry ice, and in that flash of silence, Rawlins knew what he had done, knew what he had become. He woke with a start, sheets tangled, breath ragged, skin soaked in sweat, cold as grave soil. The darkness in the room was absolute, the kind that swallows sound. He sat up, heart pounding against nothing. Slowly, he stood and walked to the mirror. What looked back was not a lawman, not a veteran, not even a man, just a face, tired, cracked at the edges, with eyes that darted like a cornered animal. Then something snapped. His fist went through the glass with the full weight of rage and shame combined. Shards exploded, raining down like broken commandments. Blood pooled quickly along the knuckles, but he didn't flinch. The mirror had failed to show him his reflection for months. Now, it showed nothing at all. He stared at the wound, the dripping red, the missing glass, and then at the corner of the mirror still intact. There, faintly, just barely, the edge of his police uniform sleeve showed in a ghost reflection, like a costume once worn and now discarded. It was no longer armor, just fabric, just pretense. Rawlins turned away, his breath catching in his throat like a man choking on silence. He didn't curse, didn't scream, just pressed the towel against his hand and slumped into the chair. The weight, he felt now, wasn't from suspension or public disgrace. It was the weight of a ghost's hand that had touched a place in him that wasn't supposed to be empty. And it was, entirely. The night after the mirror cracked and the silence grew claws, something shifted, slow, not dramatic, but tectonic. The kind of shift you don't notice until the walls start to lean. Rawlins stayed out of sight. The city moved without him, but the FBI did not forget. Official inquiries had turned to forensic audits. Every case Rawlins ever touched was being reopened. Every sealed file, every discarded complaint, every body buried under paperwork now rose like questions from the grave. When the call came, Dante didn't ask who it was. He just said when and where. The agent on the other end responded with a time, an address, and nothing else, because nothing else needed to be said. The room was cold, functional, and fluorescent lit. No echo, no furniture beyond a steel table and 4 chairs. It was a federal intake room, scrubbed clean of personality by design. In the chair across from Dante sat a special agent, gray suit, gray tie, gray eyes, the kind of man who didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't ask unless he already had the answer. But still, protocol was protocol. Name? The agent began. Graves, Dante R., the agent typed. Former military? Yes. Current occupation? Observer. Affiliation? Independent. The typing paused for half a second, then resumed. You were present at the Rawlins inquiry. Why? Dante reached into his satchel and pulled out a thick file. It made a dull, decisive thud on the metal. He didn't slide it over. He didn't explain. He just let it sit between them like a wound slowly uncovered. The agent finally leaned forward and opened the file. Inside were 6 case summaries, 6 names, 6 photos, all victims, all black, all ignored. Each case was marked closed or settled or dismissed. In small handwriting at the bottom of the first page, Dante had written only one line: they don't write anymore. No signature, no justification, no self-righteous speech, just that. The agent said nothing for a long time. The hum of the fluorescent light above buzzed louder. This is significant, the agent finally said. It's not. Dante's voice was flat. It's overdue. The agent raised an eyebrow. Why you? Dante looked him dead in the eye. Because no one else came back. He didn't speak after that. He didn't need to. The file did the talking. 6 lives cataloged in detail, names once reduced to case numbers, now printed in full block capitals, each with a short paragraph at the end, typed by Dante himself, not about how they died, but how they lived, where they worked, what they dreamed of, who did they protected, whose birthdays they remembered. The human weight of those names made the agent shift in his seat, but he didn't protest. This wasn't a protest room. This was a reckoning room. The agent finally said, "We'll need a formal statement." Dante nodded. "Put theirs first." "Yours?" the agent asked. Dante leaned back. "Mine's already written. You're sitting in it." There was a beat of silence. A kind of silence that didn't ask for agreement. It demanded acknowledgement. Slowly, the agent closed the file, stood, and left the room. Dante remained seated, unmoving, eyes on the steel wall. There were no cameras, no witnesses, but if you'd stood outside the door long enough, you might have heard something beneath the buzz of the light. Not a whisper, not a breath, just the sound of names refusing to be forgotten. He held a small data chip between his fingers. No folder, no flourish, just silence and truth compressed into one digital blade. He placed the chip on the evidence table, then turned to the gallery, saying nothing. The clerk inserted the chip into the court system. The screen behind the judge flickered to life. A video began. The footage was grainy, time-stamped 6 years prior, captured from a grainy body cam that had been quietly logged and never officially logged. It showed a medal ceremony. Rollins stood front and center, smiling. Behind him, shaking his hand, was the director of personnel for the sheriff's department, David H. Rollins, his cousin. The citation was read aloud, citing exceptional bravery in the face of community unrest. No details were given, no incident named, just vague language wrapped in star-spangled protocol. The judge squinted. The gallery began to murmur, but Dante didn't speak, not yet. He simply watched the room absorb the rot. The camera panned out to show others clapping, their applause tepid, uncertain, forced. Then a single voice broke the silence. "That's not valor, that's nepotism." The words echoed not from the screen, but from Graves. He had spoken, finally, but not loud, just clear. "That's a trophy carved from a family tree, a ribbon of self-congratulation pinned on the chest of silence." Gasps echoed. The courtroom hadn't seen anything illegal yet, but the moral indictment was already screaming. Dante walked back to his seat, calm, composed. It was the internet that exploded first. The court feed had been public. A single clip was all it took. Rollins, standing proud. Rollins is being congratulated. Rollins is being filmed by his own blood. Then Dante's voice, added at the end, turned into a fire starter. "A badge awarded by your cousin is not a shield, it's a framed envelope." By nightfall, the clip had gone viral. The hashtag appeared without a prompt. Fake badges, real blood. Veterans began to weigh in. Not the keyboard warriors, but real ones. Men and women with torn knees, burned backs, and medals earned under fire. They didn't shout. They posted photos of their medals, placed next to death certificates, folded flags, and letters from the Department of Defense. Then they posted a second photo, Rollins' badge, with a red X over it. It didn't take long. Petitions surfaced. The National Veterans Council submitted a formal recommendation to revoke all civilian-issued commendations awarded to Brent Rollins. The seal on the letter wasn't digital, it was embossed. Rollins didn't speak for days. When asked by the press outside the courthouse about the clip, he sneered, "That man's a lunatic with a martyr complex." But even his voice cracked halfway through. He'd seen the letter. He knew what was coming, and worse, he knew it was irreversible. A medal from your cousin doesn't look like justice when truth walks in with scars and silence. Inside the department, the pressure multiplied. Officers who'd once nodded at Rollins in hallways now avoided eye contact. Some whispered, others didn't bother. The name Dante Graves had become more than a name. It was a mirror, and in that mirror, a lot of people were seeing things they didn't want to admit they'd worn too long. Dante never gave another statement. He didn't hold interviews, he didn't gloat, but he did send one envelope to the local news. Inside was a photo of the silver star he had carried into court. Below it, a single line, written in the same hand as the file he'd delivered to the FBI. There's a difference between recognition and reflection. One shines for others, the other makes you see yourself. That quote ended up on protest signs. Not shouted, not chanted, just held. Raised in silence by former soldiers, grieving families, and those who understood that honor can be faked, but respect never lives in the ink of forged paperwork. It lives in what people whisper when you leave the room. And Rollins? His medals were eventually revoked, quietly. No cameras, just a notification on his profile and a letter marked Final Decision. But that didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that for the first time in his life, Brent Rollins was wearing a uniform that no longer had meaning, and it showed. His badge was still in its leather holder, but when he touched it, there was no weight, no pride. Just plastic, just brass, just lies polished to look like something heavier. He held a slim black folder in one hand, fingers locked over its surface like it held something heavier than evidence, maybe memory, maybe pain. Before anyone could speak, before a protocol could interrupt the silence, the doors behind them creaked open. A congressional oversight committee, all eyes, all cameras, all agendas, filed in. The lights dimmed fractionally, not by design but by consequence, as though the room itself understood the weight it now bore. A senator, older, lined with age and war scars, both physical and political, leaned into the microphone and asked the question everyone had written in their heads, but no one had yet spoken. "Officer Brent Rollins," he said, voice polished but edged, "do you feel remorse for kicking a man who turned out to be a decorated SEAL veteran in the middle of a courtroom without provocation?" The room went still. He could have heard the microphone static shift. Rollins blinked. A flicker of calculation passed over his face, but it died quickly under the weight of too many eyes and too much truth. He opened his mouth, hesitated, then said, "I thought he was a threat." The senator didn't blink. "And if he were your son?" That pause, 1 second, 2, 3, was longer than any speech could survive. Rollins froze. There was no prepared answer for that question. No training module. No legal script. Dante didn't speak. He didn't have to. He tilted his head slightly down, as if mourning something private but immense, the kind of grief no camera could interpret correctly. And then, from the seats, those civilian rows too often ignored, came the first sound, a slow, deliberate clap. One pair of hands, then another. But it wasn't for Rollins. It wasn't even for Dante's silence. It was for the moment, the fracture line where someone's decency held fast and someone else's finally broke. The applause stopped almost as quickly as it started. It was never meant to cheer. It was meant to acknowledge. Rollins stared ahead, blinking too fast now. Not because of the question, not even because of the implication, but because he realized in that moment that every shred of armor he'd built around himself, every justification, every award, every press badge and uniform thread had become see-through under the weight of a single hypothetical. What if that man were your son? It wasn't just the courtroom he'd lost. It was the illusion of control, the myth of righteousness. Dante stood immobile, hands at his sides, a stillness that weighed more than fury. His silence wasn't passive. It was deliberate. It was the kind of silence you only hear from men who've held their dying friends in dust-choked foreign lands and decided to keep breathing anyway. No vengeance in his eyes, just a certainty that made lesser men tremble. The senator leaned forward again. "Mr. Graves, would you care to respond?" Dante raised his head, not looking at the senator, but at the crowd, at the collective pulse of judgment, assumption, history, and hurt that filled the chamber like fog. He took one breath, shook his head. No. One syllable, final, immovable. The microphone didn't need more. The cameras didn't either. Because in that room, at that moment, everything had already been said. Not a word of it needed to come from the man they'd tried to silence. The committee chair cleared his throat and closed the file in front of him. No vote was needed. No resolution passed. This wasn't about the law anymore. It was about truth, the kind that doesn't fit neatly into legal briefs or televised hearings. Rollins shrank in his seat, not dramatically, not with the theatrics of guilt, but with the slow, irreversible erosion of a man who had finally been seen fully and without his costume. He tried to pick up his badge again, the one on the table beside the pistol. His hand hovered but didn't close around it, and in that moment it became clear the badge was no longer his to hold. Not because of protocol, because of shame, because everyone in the room knew what he hadn't said, and worse, what he had. Outside, as the doors opened and people began to file out, there was no press scrum. No fireworks, just a line of footsteps echoing like quiet thunder down a marble hallway. Dante walked last, not for effect, for control. He always walked behind those he protected, even when no one asked him to, and in that hallway, in that silence, the question still hovered in the air like smoke. What kind of man doesn't answer when insulted, when provoked, when brutalized in plain sight? The kind who understands that justice doesn't always need a voice. Sometimes it just needs presence, and presence, that day, belonged to the man who never raised his voice, but shattered a system with silence. Rollins stood on the outer gravel path of the veterans' shelter, not in uniform, not in anything that resembled his old self. The sky above was flat and silent, the clouds hanging like folded flags, waiting for a wind that refused to come. He had parked a block away, walked the rest under a hood, hands shoved in the pockets of a coat that used to carry pride. Now it only held sweat and second thoughts. He didn't knock, didn't call, just waited, because that was all he had left. Time and the weight of every moment that came after. Truth, the kind of truth that doesn't scream. It settles and chokes. Dante emerged through the double doors, unhurried, his footsteps pressing into gravel with the exactness of a man who had never run from anything in his life. His gait hadn't changed. His shoulders still bore the architecture of quiet command. He wasn't surprised to see Rollins. He stopped a few feet away, unreadable, not hostile, not inviting, just present. That presence alone forced Rollins to shift weight between his feet, trying to find balance in a conversation he wasn't sure how to start. "I'll be sentenced soon," Rollins said, voice cracked, gravel riding the edge of every word. "The report's done. The committee made their recommendation." Dante said nothing. His eyes stayed steady, not cold, just complete. Rollins looked down, the gravel biting at his soles. "But I kept thinking, if you hadn't hit back, I might have walked. You could have crushed me in that courtroom. But you waited." Silence. Not the kind that demanded a response, the kind that absorbed one. "So why?" Rollins asked, quieter now. "Why did you do it like that? Why didn't you humiliate me when you could have?" His voice strained for something that didn't sound like guilt, because guilt was a language he hadn't learned. It sounded more like a man chasing the last syllables of his relevance. "You let me implode instead. You let me burn myself." Dante reached into the inside of his jacket, slow, precise, like every motion was chosen before the day even began. From the fold, he pulled out a small linen wrap, tied tight at the corners. The fabric was coarse, the color of forgotten desert sand. He held it out without ceremony. Rollins hesitated, then took it cautiously. It was heavier than it looked, warm almost, as if it had a memory. "What is it?" he asked, barely above a whisper. Dante finally spoke, just 6 words. "It carried the ashes of graves." Rollins blinked. Your brother?" No answer. Haydn's ashes? Still silence. Rollins started to unwrap the corners with trembling fingers, the folds unfurling like pages of a truth he wasn't sure he deserved to read. But there was no urn, no photo, just the raw integrity of sand, Kandahar sand, still clinging to the last echo of a man who never made it home in one piece. Sand mixed with the dust of duty, with blood that never got to cool in a hospital bed. Dante looked down at the linen, then back up. "I brought it back." For his wife, she said she couldn't hold him. This was the closest she could get, so I kept it until the war ended, until someone asked why I still carried it. A beat passed. Now I'm giving it to the only person who made me wish it weighed more. That landed like a punch Rollins hadn't trained for. His mouth opened, but no words came. The silence wasn't awkward. It was absolute, like judgment handed down from something older than courts, older than laws. Dante didn't add more. He didn't raise his voice. There was no sermon in him. No need for it. The weight of the sand had done all the talking. Rollins closed the wrap slowly, hands trembling. He looked up, but Dante was already turning. The conversation was over because it had never really been a conversation. It was a reckoning, disguised as mercy, and it left Rollins standing still, like the last man on a battlefield who hadn't realized yet that the fighting was done, but the war was lost. Rollins stood there, staring at the ragged cloth in his hands as if it had grown thorns. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. The sand inside the bundle had shifted slightly with the exchange, its weight barely tangible yet crushing in significance. He turned it over slowly, his fingers twitching, unable to decide whether to grip it tighter or drop it entirely. The Kandahar earth had turned to ash long ago, but this was preserved, and with it every action, every order, every silence he'd buried under procedure and self-preservation. He looked up, hoping for a flicker of forgiveness in Dante's eyes, but found only the calm of someone who had long since buried vengeance beneath duty. There was no rage, no gloating, no trace of satisfaction, just that same silent acknowledgement that had haunted Rollins for weeks, the stare of a man who had walked through fire and chosen to carry the burn marks rather than inflict them. Behind them, the wind carried the hum of drills and steel, the sound of other veterans rebuilding, healing, doing what Rollins never dared to do, face what they'd become. Dante's figure remained steady, unshaken, a silhouette cast in iron, and yet the pain wasn't in his posture, it was in the silence, in the space where Rollins had expected fury but found history, a history that included him only as a warning, not a participant. The seconds dragged, dense and suffocating. Rollins tried to speak again, to construct something that might pass for remorse. His voice cracked like old paint. I didn't think anyone would come back for him. His words dropped between them like stones, small, dull, useless. Dante didn't blink. He didn't nod. He didn't need to. The answer had already been delivered, not in a speech, not in a verdict, but in the act of showing up, in a gesture older than forgiveness and more final than justice. The cloth in Rollins's hand began to feel heavier. He stared down at it again. The fabric wasn't just military, it was scorched, darkened by the memories it refused to forget. He remembered Kandahar differently, heat waves distorting reason, orders shouted through dust, casualties ignored for quotas. He had never carried a body, never held a line with blood slicking his fingers. Not like Dante, not like Haydn. He glanced around the empty courtyard, as if the sun might offer him some defense, but the sky was merciless and blue, the same color as the shirt Dante wore the day he walked into that courtroom, invisible, yet undeniable. Rollins gritted his teeth. I wore the badge, he muttered. I served too. Dante's eyes narrowed, not with anger but disbelief, the kind that strips a man bare without ever raising its voice. You wore it, Dante said finally, voice so low it scraped gravel, but you never carried it. The line sliced clean through Rollins' chest. He had nothing to answer with, because deep down, in places not even denial could reach, he knew it was true. He had worn the uniform like armor, not responsibility, like a ticket, not a burden. Dante turned to go. Rollins reached forward, one step too slow. What am I supposed to do with this? He asked, lifting the cloth like it might erupt in his hands. Dante paused, back still turned. That's not mine to answer, he said, but don't bury it. With that, he walked off, not with the strut of a victor, but the pace of someone who had already won something deeper. Peace without surrender. Rollins stood alone in the dust-heavy silence after Dante's footsteps faded. The cloth bundle in his palm hadn't moved, but it felt as if it had grown roots into his skin. It was no longer just an object. It was evidence of what he ignored, of what he chose not to see, of what he silenced. with boots, with cuffs, with force. He tried to shake the weight from his shoulders, the same way he used to brush off accusations, complaints, and moments of doubt, but it clung to him now like smoke from a fire long extinguished, but never fully smothered. He sat on the edge of a concrete planter just outside the veteran housing, uninvited, unwelcome, but unable to walk away. In the background, someone was grilling, meat sizzling, laughter breaking out in bursts, a different kind of brotherhood, one he had never earned. A few men eyed him with wary curiosity, but said nothing. He didn't blame them. He didn't look like one of them anymore, and perhaps never had. He stared at the edges of the cloth, tracing the folds like reading a map, back into who he might have been. He hadn't always been like this, had he? There were days, early on, when he believed in something, or at least told himself he did: order, security, maybe even honor. But somewhere between the promotions, the unchecked power, and the system that rewarded silence over truth, Rollins had made peace with being necessary instead of good. Now, that peace lay in tatters. He recalled the first time he ever lied on a report, a small omission, a push he called standard procedure. The guy didn't complain, most don't, but that moment had been the gateway, one routine escalation after another, and soon Rollins wasn't just enforcing the rules, he was writing them, skewing them, hiding behind them, until the rules meant nothing but self-protection. Now here he was, stripped of uniform, stripped of illusion, holding a handful of dirt and memory, gifted not in revenge but in reckoning. He wanted to curse Dante, wanted to find some flaw in his restraint, but the truth was harder than any insult. The man hadn't come to punish him. He'd come to witness the result, and Rollins couldn't meet that kind of gaze. It wasn't fury that unmade him, it was clarity. A child ran by chasing a stray ball, tripped near his feet and paused, staring at the cloth bundle in his hands. "What's that?" the boy asked. Rollins opened his mouth, then shut it. What could he say? That it was that proof of everything he'd failed to become? That it was a piece of earth soaked in someone else's blood, handed to him not in anger but in memory? He managed a dry whisper. "It's something I should have carried a long time ago." The boy nodded, perhaps not understanding but sensing the weight in his voice. Then he ran off, free in the way Rollins no longer was. And it hit him then. This wasn't about guilt. It was about responsibility. Guilt could be avoided, could be denied, could be rationalized away. Responsibility didn't care about feelings. It stood there, unwavering, until it was answered, and Dante had delivered it in a handful of dust. That night, Rollins didn't go home. He couldn't. The air inside his apartment felt stale, like it belonged to someone else, some version of him that had lived behind polished plaques, crooked smiles, and clean boots. He walked the streets instead, past shuttered storefronts, neon signs flickering like faulty memories, and glass reflections that refused to show him clearly. Everything felt like a mirror cracked from the inside. He ended up at the War Memorial Plaza, a place he had never truly looked at. It had always just been stone and names to him. Now, each etched letter felt like it stared back. One of the plaques bore the name Hayden J. Williams. He hadn't remembered that, didn't care to notice when it was first mounted. Just another dead soldier. Now, it felt different, not because of who Hayden was, but because of what he represented. A promise kept by someone else. A life mourned in silence, and a weight he could no longer pass off as policy. Rollins crouched near the base of the memorial, ran his hand across the bronzed letters. The cold metal didn't flinch under his touch. It just remained, immovable, eternal, patient, like truth, like justice, like Dante Graves. He heard footsteps behind him, slow, steady. For a heartbeat, he thought maybe it was Dante again, but it wasn't. Just a man walking his dog, nodding politely before moving on. That momentary pulse of tension left Rollins strangely empty. He had half hoped it would be Dante, that there'd be something else. Another confrontation, one more chance to say something useful, even if it was too late. But Dante had already said all he needed to say, without raising his voice, without a threat. Just a single gesture, one that rewrote the entire language of power between them. Rollins looked up at the night sky. searching for something, maybe absolution, maybe just a sign that silence had meaning. All he found was the sound of distant sirens, echoing through the streets like ghosts of decisions he couldn't take back. Eventually, he stood, feeling the strain in his knees. He was older than he looked, or maybe just worn in ways uniforms didn't show. As he turned to leave, he caught one last glance at Haydn's name. This time, he didn't flinch. Back at his apartment, Rawlins finally unwrapped the cloth. The grains of Kandahar sand spilled into his hands, dry and ancient. He didn't know why, but he knelt, pressed his fingers into it, and whispered, not a prayer, not an apology, but simply, I remember now. It was the only thing he had left to offer, and somewhere far away, that was enough. The hall was not designed for silence, but it carried it better than applause. Rows of seats were filled by uniforms old and new, medals glinting under dimmed lights like cold, watching eyes. The air wasn't tense, it was loaded, with things that had never been said, with names that hadn't been spoken aloud in years, with debts that no system had ever tried to repay. At the center of it all, Dante Graves stood without introduction, without permission, and without a single paper to read from. All he held was a folder, frayed at the edges, thick with weight that wasn't measured in pages. There was no mic, there was no need. The room leaned forward when he breathed. Rawlins sat near the front, close enough to see every blink, every twitch of Dante's jaw. He had been ordered to attend. Not charged yet, not sentenced, just summoned, like a shadow to its source. He had shaved that morning, as if cleanliness could erase memory, but nothing could scrub the sound of that folder hitting the table, not anymore. Dante opened it, one sheet, a single name, spoken like the ringing of a brass bell. Private Anthony Ruiz. He could rebuild a field radio, blindfolded. Said it was easier than trying to get his dad to talk about Vietnam. Played harmonica before lights out. Didn't like sleeping in silence. He paused, let the weight settle, then turned the page. Sergeant Melissa Grant. Called herself Iron Veins. Carried a squad mate on her back during an ambush in Ghazni. Didn't flinch when patched up. Said pain was just the tax for staying alive. Had a tattoo of her sister's initials on her ribs. Never told anyone why. Rawlins's fingers curled into his pant leg. His mouth was dry. He didn't know how many names were in that folder, but it felt like every name was a hammer, and he was the nail they had been saving for last. Corporal James Harlow. Never missed target practice. First to volunteer for mine-clearing patrol. Laughed a cough and used it every time someone got scared. Left behind a list of bad jokes in his locker. They still make me laugh. There was no flourish, no courtroom theatrics. Dante's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Each name cracked like ice splitting on a frozen river. Every eye in the room turned not just to listen, but to remember, even if they had never met these people. Lieutenant Reggie Maids from Tulsa. Played chess on his wristwatch with himself. Beat everyone except Melissa. Said every war was a board game, but most folks never learned how to play past the pawns. Lost half his squad and still kept writing letters for their families. Rawlins looked at the exit, but leaving would be louder than staying, and louder than guilt. Private First Class Dana E. Cole. Never fired a bullet that didn't matter. Wrote poetry on ration boxes. Died in a convoy that was never reported to the press, because there was no one left alive to confirm it. Dante's hands didn't shake, but his eyes stayed fixed on each letter of every name. He didn't describe how they died. He described how they lived. He let the absence write itself. Then came the last page, the sixth. It hung in the air before he spoke. Sergeant Haydn J. Williams. The room tightened, even the air. Biggie's rations to recruits. Broke protocol to pull a kid out of an overturned Humvee. Never once did he wear his Purple Heart in public. Thought it was unfair to outshine the dead. Dante closed the folder, set it down, then looked at Rawlins. Without accusation, just presence. A man looking at another who now had to live with what that meant. Rawlins blinked once. A soundless flinch. like a man dodging a punch already landed. He tried to fix his posture, to restore some illusion of command, but the gravity in the room was no longer his to resist. He had worn the badge, yes, had barked orders, filed reports, and signed off decisions, but none of that mattered here, because this wasn't a court of law. This was a reckoning, and reckoning didn't ask for defense. It just stood there and waited. A veteran sitting in the third row wiped his eyes, not out of grief, but out of recognition. Another clenched his fists in his lap, knuckles whitening, not out of anger, but out of solidarity. They had all known a Ruiz, a Grant, a Williams, some by name, some only by the smell of blood and canvas or the silence left behind after the last roll call. Dante didn't speak again. He didn't have to. His silence wasn't a pause, it was punctuation. Rollins shifted, his eyes drawn involuntarily to the folder now resting on the edge of the table. Just paper, just names, but each one louder than his entire record. Each one weighed more than every report he ever falsified. When the presiding officer finally stood, clearing her throat, it was with the caution of someone interrupting a funeral. "Mr. Graves," she said quietly, "do you wish to submit these names to the honor registry?" Dante nodded once. They were never out of it. The room froze for a second longer. Then the officer made a single mark on a ledger. Not a gavel, not a ruling, just a mark. But it sounded louder than any sentence ever handed down in that building. Rollins felt it land across his chest like a sealed envelope with his name scratched out. From somewhere behind him, a low voice murmured, "That's the kind of reading that sticks longer than scripture." Dante finally turned, not toward Rollins, but toward the flag at the far end of the chamber. His posture was relaxed, but his presence had not faded. He had said all he needed, yet the space he left behind would not shrink. It would echo. Rollins stared at the folder again, still unmoving, still just paper, but now it was a graveyard written in ink, and somehow it felt like he was the one being buried. The hearing adjourned, but no one stood. The officer's hand rested gently on her notes, eyes scanning the walls as if the paint might reveal more names that had been missed. The gallery did not disperse. It lingered, not out of confusion, but out of respect, as if leaving too soon would betray the gravity still pulsing between the seats. Rollins remained frozen. He had imagined anger, protest, even a surge of justification when the past finally caught up, but nothing came. No outburst, no defense. Just a hollow vacuum inside him where pride used to sit, and in its place, names, 6 of them, all carried by a man who hadn't needed a podium, hadn't needed to shout. He thought of that moment in Kandahar, the first time he saw Haydn bleeding in the dust. Not how he fell, but how Rollins didn't kneel, didn't call for help, didn't raise his voice, just pressed a knee where no man deserved it, held it there until movement stopped. He hadn't called it murder, he'd told himself it was control, tactical necessity, securing the scene, but there had been no threat. Just a body with too much dignity. Now, years later, the names of those bodies had returned. Not for vengeance, just a remembrance. And somehow that felt worse. Dante had walked away from the center of the chamber, but the path behind him felt scorched. No fire, no explosion, just the smoldering hush of consequence. Some tried to catch his eye as he passed. He didn't avoid them. He just didn't need their validation. Near the back, a woman stood with a small badge pinned to her chest, gold, insignia of fallen kin. Her lips moved softly as she read the names from a note in her hand, names she had memorized already, but still mouthed as ritual. She didn't look at Rollins. She didn't need to. Rollins looked down at his lapel. No badge, just fabric, and in that moment it felt like a lie sewn in polyester. One of the younger officers leaned toward him. "You okay?" he whispered. Rollins didn't answer, didn't blink, just kept staring at the space where Dante had stood, a space that still hadn't filled. Outside the chamber, the wind moved without urgency. The sky, overcast and undecided, hung above the government complex like a sheet pulled over a half-finished story. Dante stood by by the front steps, alone, hands folded behind his back like he had once stood for roll call in some place no longer on the map. He didn't wait for applause. He wasn't there for closure. He had said their names. That was enough. Rollins exited minutes later, not escorted, not condemned, just exposed. He stopped on the last stair, unsure whether to speak, to apologize, to vanish. Dante didn't look at him. That, more than any glare or judgment, broke something. "You could have lied today," Rollins said, voice low, brittle. "Could have added more, made it look worse." Dante turned slowly, not with threat, but with presence, like silence answering back. "I didn't need to," he said. The truth was heavy enough. Rollins nodded once. It wasn't agreement. It was surrender. He glanced at the folder in Dante's hand. "Those names, you remember them all?" Dante didn't smile. "I don't get to forget." They stood there, two men with nothing left to say that hadn't already been felt. Behind them, the building still held echoes. Inside, the names still hung in the air like unsung verses of an unfinished anthem. When Rollins walked away, he didn't look back, not out of pride, but because he knew what he'd see. Dante still standing, unshaken, holding the weight of 6 names. And maybe, for the first time, Rollins felt the weight of his name finally shift from hollow metal into something breakable. The room, thick with tension and crowded with blinking camera lenses, grew still as the county sheriff took his place behind the podium. His uniform was meticulously ironed, buttons glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights, a facade of discipline and integrity. He adjusted the microphone deliberately, clearing his throat with practiced ease. The sheriff's expression was stern, controlled, yet beneath the practiced composure lingered a subtle twitch, a betrayal of anxiety barely hidden. A reporter stood, her voice steady but edged with pointed skepticism. "Sheriff, there have been persistent allegations that your department has systematically protected Officer Brent Rollins despite credible evidence of misconduct. What is your official response?" The sheriff allowed a brief pause, calculated enough to convey confidence, before delivering a response so coldly dismissive it seemed to freeze the very air around him. "We trust our officers," he declared, every syllable dripping with authority and arrogance, a clear indication that he would entertain no further debate. The silence that followed was punctuated only by the soft mechanical whir of cameras refocusing, capturing the icy resolve etched deeply in his hardened features. Yet, in the oppressive quiet, a scraping sound cut sharply through the atmosphere. Heads turned toward the back of the conference room, where an elderly officer slowly rose from his chair. The old man, Officer Franklin Hughes, a figure etched in deep lines of dignity and quiet resolve, advanced a few steps into the aisle. Without a single unnecessary word, he lifted a hand to his hat, removed it with slow deliberation, and placed it onto the table beside him with reverent finality. His voice, though weathered by decades of service, rang clear, resolute, and impossible to ignore. "I will not let this badge die alongside my self-respect." Every word carried an immense weight, as if spoken not only to the gathered press, but directly to the very heart of a crumbling, corrupted institution. For a long second, the sheriff's face revealed something rare and raw. Astonishment quickly eclipsed by fury. His jaw tightened visibly, eyes narrowing as though looking at a traitor, a man he once considered an ally, now turned adversary by conscience alone. "Officer Hughes," the sheriff hissed through clenched teeth, his voice barely containing the acid sting of betrayal, "consider carefully what you're doing here. You are undermining the integrity of this entire department." But Officer Hughes remained immovable, his gaze steady and unwavering, unfazed by the sheriff's simmering hostility. "Integrity," Hughes echoed, his tone crisp and cutting with restrained indignation. "Integrity isn't a badge, Sheriff. It's not a piece of metal you pin on your chest to convince people you're honorable. Integrity lives or dies in actions, in the quiet choices we make every day. And right now, your actions speak louder than any badge ever could." Cameras surged forward, capturing every nuance of this unprecedented clash, every wrinkle of defiance, and every flicker of suppressed anger. Reporters scribbled furiously, laptops clicked incessantly, capturing a rare moment when moral courage faced down power without flinching. The sheriff, suddenly stripped of his ironclad composure, stood momentarily speechless, exposed beneath the relentless gaze of lenses and eyes that saw clearly through his fabricated image. And then Dante Graves moved slightly from where he stood quietly at the side of the room. His presence, so calm and yet undeniably commanding, drew the attention of everyone present. Dante didn't speak, not a single word. Instead, he directed his gaze toward Officer Hughes, a look charged with deep, unspoken respect. In that silence, Dante's simple nod was thunderous. It held no words but carried a monumental clarity. Officer Hughes was not alone. The gesture passed swiftly, yet lingered, electrifying the air, sparking an immediate fracture that rippled visibly through Rawlins's allies, standing stiffly along the back wall. It was as if the unity they once projected shattered at that exact moment, splintering into reparable fragments. Faces that moments before had remained hard and defiant began to falter, casting uncertain glances toward their shoes or shifting uncomfortably beneath the oppressive weight of public scrutiny. The sheriff himself now seemed smaller, somehow, as though the uniform he wore had shrunk dramatically around him, leaving a diminished figure struggling to maintain an illusion that no longer convinced anyone. Officer Hughes remained standing, quietly composed, every ounce of his dignity intact, watching patiently as the consequences of his choice unfolded. His shoulders, though weary with years, were still squared, unbowed beneath the symbolic weight of his gesture. He had handed over his badge willingly, knowing precisely what it meant, a sacrifice of personal legacy for the greater dignity of justice itself. The sheriff struggled visibly to regain control, stepping forward once more, attempting to steer the narrative back to familiar ground. "Officer Hughes," he growled, voice dripping bitter condescension, "this emotional display may make for good headlines, but we deal in facts, not sentimental gestures." Yet Hughes, with a quietness that resonated louder than shouting, replied simply, "The truth isn't sentimental, Sheriff. It's factual. And the truth is, you have protected a badge over the lives it was meant to serve." This final retort seemed to hang suspended in the tense air, potent and inescapable. The room pulsed silently with a shared understanding. Hughes had shattered not only the sheriff's carefully cultivated image, but also the false narratives of an entire corrupted system. Dante watched it all with eyes that reflected a depth of respect reserved only for those willing to sacrifice comfort and security for principles higher than themselves. As cameras continued their relentless documentation, the sheriff's hands betrayed him, trembling slightly as he stepped away from the podium, his retreat as symbolic as the confrontation itself. In that instant, Officer Hughes stood as a towering figure of integrity, while the sheriff faded into something lesser, defeated not by force or violence, but by simple courage and clarity of moral purpose. Dante stepped back slightly, blending once more into the room's periphery. Yet his presence remained palpable, a powerful echo of justice and integrity. He did not need to speak further. His silence now carried a message more resonant than any words could have delivered. The crowd, reporters, citizens, and fellow officers alike, absorbed the scene fully, sensing history unfold before their eyes. The fracture initiated by Officer Hughes had now become a chasm. No badge or uniform could repair the damage, no polished speeches could disguise the corruption laid bare for all to witness. As Officer Hughes quietly resumed his seat, dignity intact and purpose fulfilled, the conference room seemed transformed. No longer just a stage for official statements, it had become a courtroom, with the silent judgment of the collective conscience delivering a verdict more final than any legal pronouncement. In that quiet aftermath, the sheriff, now seemingly deflated and stripped bare of authority, could only stare blankly forward, recognizing, perhaps for the first time, the true cost of his choices. Dante Graves merely watched, understanding deeply and profoundly that justice was never won through force alone, but through quiet courage, through moral clarity, through a willingness to stand, even silently, against wrongdoing. And within that powerful, silent recognition lay a truth everyone in the room now understood clearly. A false uniform could never uphold the dignity of true justice. The courtroom, austere in its stark neutrality, was packed with an audience whose silence bore a palpable weight. The gathered crowd seemed united not merely by curiosity, but by a profound sense of righteous inevitability, a quiet anticipation of justice long overdue. Officer Brent Rollins stood isolated at the center, stripped of the armor his uniform once provided. Now clad in a plain suit that looked oddly unnatural on his rigid frame, he appeared visibly diminished, as though each fiber of the fabric refused to disguise the stains of his transgressions. A small podium had been placed deliberately before him, bearing a list whose length was an indictment in itself, the weight of each page pressing down relentlessly upon him. The judge's voice was unwavering, stern, yet dispassionate as the sentence was pronounced, a ruling crafted with cruel poetic justice rather than conventional punishment alone. "Mr. Rollins," the judge articulated with deliberate precision, "your penalty is not merely incarceration. Before you leave this room, you will publicly acknowledge each victim whose suffering was inflicted by your own hands. You will speak their names clearly, each one accompanied by a brief description of your actions toward them. Let history hear your confession plainly, so that your crimes might never again be mistaken for acts of law." Rollins swallowed hard, his throat tightening visibly. His eyes, once filled with disdain and defiance, flickered with panic as he felt the oppressive stare of every veteran, every officer, every citizen present. No sympathy existed within these walls for a man whose badge had become an emblem of cruelty rather than honor. The silence amplified his every breath, each hesitant exhale seeming louder than the echoing gavel had moments before. Drawing a trembling breath, Rollins leaned forward, eyes fixed stubbornly downward at the paper before him, as though the sight of faces in the audience, living, judging, accusing, would fracture his resolve entirely. "Samuel King," he began, voice cracking faintly, "stopped for an alleged minor traffic violation, assaulted without justification." The stark admission sent a ripple through the room, a quiet yet devastating acknowledgement. "Marcus Green," Rollins continued, the syllables heavy and leaden with reluctant admission, "wrongfully detained, held overnight without charges, beaten until unconscious." With each name spoken aloud, Rollins's posture deteriorated further, shoulders curving under the crushing weight of shame. Each syllable seemed to strip away another protective layer, leaving him raw, exposed, and utterly vulnerable. The audience watched, faces stony and unsparing, their eyes never blinking, as if daring him to falter, daring him to diminish even slightly the stark truth of his cruelty. "Jonathan Ray," Rollins murmured next, his voice faltering now, hoarse with the strain of forced humility, arrested under pretenses, choked until pleading for breath. A visible tremor coursed through his hands, betraying his rapidly eroding composure. Rollins, once so confident, once the embodiment of unchecked power, now stood trembling like a man facing his impending execution. Each name a nail hammered mercilessly into his dwindling pride. "Tyrell Lewis," he continued, the whispers now struggling past lips gone dry, eyes darting briefly upward only to swiftly retreat, unable to face the fury that radiated from Dante Graves's silent presence at the back of the chamber. "Assaulted publicly without provocation, sustained multiple fractures." The sound of Rollins's admission carried through the chamber, cold and precise, echoing back at him as though the walls themselves condemned him anew with each word. Then came a name that halted Rollins entirely, reducing his voice to a breathless whisper. "Hayden Williams." The utterance was barely audible, yet detonated with the force of a bomb in the stillness of the courtroom. Rollins's jaw quivered visibly. His breath became ragged, uncontrolled, as the full, unmitigated horror of his past finally gripped him without mercy. He tried desperately to maintain control, eyes blinking rapidly to stave off the betraying tears, but the weight of this particular name broke him utterly. "Hayden Williams," he repeated, voice shuddering openly now, unable to conceal the crack in his facade. Pinned down, assaulted, ignored, until he was no longer breathing. A sob emerged abruptly, strangled, agonizingly raw, an involuntary betrayal of his remaining defenses. For the first time, Rollins openly wept, shoulders shaking, no longer able to suppress the shame and remorse that surged violently within him. His arrogance had dissolved into a flood of self-realization, a man confronting the harrowing legacy of his contempt. The room did not stir, no voices rose in outrage or sympathy. Instead, they remained silent, each individual allowing the devastating truth of Rollins's breakdown to settle irrevocably into the collective conscience. Justice, they understood now, did not require the theatrics of vengeance. It thrived in the solemn, crushing weight of truth. Dante Graves, who had remained a shadowed pillar of silent dignity throughout, now quietly rose from his seat in the far back corner. His face was expressionless, unreadable, yet the very act of standing seemed to draw all eyes toward him, a beacon of moral clarity in a room submerged beneath the weight of revealed atrocity. Dante did not look at Rollins. He did not glance at the judge, nor acknowledge the gathered audience. Instead, he simply turned, shoulders squared and spine unbowed, stepping deliberately toward the exit. No applause followed him. No audible praise marked his departure. Instead, as Dante Graves passed through the courtroom doors, every single person in the chamber rose silently to their feet. It was not a gesture honoring Rollins' coerced confessions, nor an act of courtesy toward any official ruling. Rather, it was a solemn recognition of Dante's unwavering dignity and the profound, quiet strength he embodied, a strength that demanded respect without a single word spoken. Rollins, still trembling at the podium, dared only the briefest upward glance to witness this silent tribute. Seeing the room's acknowledgment of Dante, not himself, was perhaps the final and most brutal punishment he could endure. No amount of incarceration, no sentence of humiliation or penance, could surpass the crushing moral defeat reflected in that moment of collective respect for the man who had exposed him. In that stark, undeniable silence, Rollins felt the full weight of his fall, understanding deeply that he had been stripped not only of rank and uniform, but also the very power he had abused so recklessly. History would remember this day, not as his moment of repentance, but as a vivid testament to the dignity of those he had wronged, personified in Dante's quiet, implacable resolve. As the doors closed behind Dante Graves, leaving Rollins alone before the merciless gaze of justice and history alike, the message was unequivocal. Evil could be conquered not merely through force or retribution, but by forcing it to confront its monstrous reflection, to speak its truth aloud. Rollins had indeed been broken, not by violence, but by the cruel, poetic justice of naming those he had harmed, each name a permanent scar carved into the memory of all who bore witness. Thus, the courtroom remained standing, unified not by the downfall of a villain, but by the rise of something far greater, an unspoken, unyielding standard of justice, dignity, and accountability. And as they stood in reverence, the audience knew with unwavering certainty that they had witnessed not merely the end of one man's tyranny, but the enduring triumph of integrity itself, as embodied in Dante Graves's silent, indomitable departure. In the quiet aftermath of justice served, the memorial service unfolded beneath a muted sky, where somber clouds lay gently atop the horizon like a comforting hand. The gathered crowd, composed of families, veterans, and silent mourners, stood reverently still, their gazes fixed solemnly on the names etched onto polished granite, each letter deepened by grief and honored memory. Among these silent observers stood Dante Graves, his powerful frame draped in quiet dignity, a figure carved from the hardest realities, yet softened by an inner resolve that no force could diminish. His stance was steady, his breathing deliberate, a subtle but resolute presence that quietly commanded reverence. The ceremony concluded gently, the final notes of a mournful bugle fading away into the distance, leaving behind only whispers and the heavy solemnity of loss. Families slowly dispersed, carrying their quiet grief and shared strength into the evening air. Dante remained behind, standing respectfully distant from the dispersing crowd, his eyes reflecting the depth of unspoken memories, burdens he carried willingly and without complaint. His silence spoke louder than words, a quiet testament to resilience and integrity, the very values he embodied without pretense or boast. A small movement at the periphery of his vision drew Dante's attention, gently pulling him back from private thoughts. Turning slightly, he saw a young boy approaching tentatively, his small footsteps deliberate yet hesitant, eyes wide with innocent awe mixed with uncertainty. The boy, no older than 12, wore an oversized coat, sleeves swallowing small hands that clutched tightly at the edges of courage. Dante noted the boy's youthful face, a mirror reflecting both admiration and timid curiosity, and waited patiently as the child found the courage to speak. Finally, after a long pause, the boy's voice broke through the silence, quivering softly yet carrying clearly, "Sir, were you scared when he kicked you like that in front of everyone?" The question, simple yet profound, hung delicately in the air, a quiet echo of vulnerability and genuine wonderment. The boy's eyes searched Dante's face intently, seeking reassurance, clarity, something tangible to hold on to amid the confusion of witnessing a hero so publicly humiliated and yet somehow emerging even stronger. Dante paused, allowing himself a gentle, thoughtful breath, the quiet inhale and exhale carrying the weight of truth and compassion. Slowly, he lowered himself to the boy's level, bridging the gap between them not only physically, but also emotionally, signaling that their conversation was one of equals, built on mutual respect rather than mere authority. He reached out carefully, placing a strong, comforting hand on the boy's small shoulder, feeling the gentle shudder of nerves settle beneath the reassuring warmth of his touch. "I was," Dante admitted softly, his deep voice carrying sincerity and warmth, stripped of bravado, layered instead with quiet honesty. "At first, I was afraid, not just of being hurt physically, but afraid of something deeper, afraid of humiliation, afraid of what others would think, afraid of being seen as weak or broken." He spoke these words gently, carefully, each syllable crafted not to impart mere lessons, but to open a window into genuine human vulnerability, creating a connection rooted deeply in shared humanity. The boy's eyes widened slightly, his mouth opening as if to speak but stopping, absorbing Dante's admission with quiet reverence. Dante offered a faint, reassuring smile, gently squeezing the boy's shoulder, grounding him in the security of trust and honesty. Then, with a voice steady yet tenderly powerful, Dante continued, "But then I thought about why I needed to stand up, not for myself alone, but for those who couldn't, because someday someone else would face that same fear. And if I didn't stand up then, who would show them how to walk tall when their time came?" These words resonated deeply, each quietly powerful syllable sinking gently into the boy's consciousness, planting seeds of strength that would grow silently, inevitably shaping the man he would one day become. Dante's statement was simple yet profound, a promise unspoken but heard, that true bravery was not the absence of fear, but the courage to face it head-on, to stand unwavering even when every instinct begged for retreat. The boy remained silent for a long, meaningful moment, visibly grappling with the weight of Dante's quiet, measured confession. His young eyes, reflective and wise beyond their years, flickered briefly downward, then slowly returned to meet Dante's steady gaze, filled now with a newfound strength, a quiet determination. Then deliberately the child nodded. It was a simple gesture, no words spoken, no promises offered. Yet that silent acknowledgement conveyed more profound understanding than any speech could have. It was the nod of someone who had heard and truly understood, a quiet yet powerful commitment to carry forth the legacy of dignity, courage, and silent strength. Price reached for the This subtle gesture was enough to tighten Dante's chest, an emotion, soft yet overwhelming, quiet gratitude for the quiet power of human understanding. Without another word, Dante gently released the boy's shoulder, rising again to his full height, a quiet mountain of reassurance, a silent guardian of the values he had shared. The boy, too, straightened slightly, mirroring the quiet strength he had just silently pledged to emulate. The exchange ended without ceremony or further dialogue, both turning gently away to resume their separate paths, yet profoundly changed by a simple moment of truth shared. Dante moved slowly toward the fading light, his silhouette steady and reassuring against the horizon, a figure whose silent dignity was now forever etched into the young boy's consciousness. The child lingered briefly, gazing after him, his youthful heart quietly absorbing the silent, powerful message Dante had imparted, not through long speeches or sermons, but through genuine vulnerability and quiet example. As Dante disappeared slowly into the distance, merging with the shadows of evening, the boy felt a quiet yet profound certainty growing within himself, a quiet belief in his own future, shaped indelibly by this encounter. He knew he had witnessed something extraordinary, something quietly transformative, not the bombastic heroics of fantasy, but the silent heroism of every day, bravery, dignity, and resilience. The crowd had dispersed fully now, leaving the boy alone in the quiet space, surrounded only by names carved into stone, memories of those who had stood strong and fallen bravely. He moved toward the monument gently, reading the names quietly to himself, sensing the subtle presence of the men and women they represented. Yet, among all these carved letters, it was the memory of Dante's quiet, steady voice that resonated loudest, becoming an integral part of his growing strength. Slowly, the boy turned to walk away, his steps steady and purposeful, carrying a quiet promise within his heart, not written nor spoken, yet undeniable in its quiet strength. He had learned today that bravery was not always loud, nor strength always visible. Sometimes courage was simply standing tall when no one else dared, quietly carrying forward the torch of dignity through the shadows of fear and doubt. And as the memorial faded gently behind him, his quiet nod remained, a silent acknowledgement of a lesson learned not from speeches, but from witnessing the quiet, unwavering dignity of Dante Graves. It was a gesture that offered no promise, only profound acknowledgement, yet it lingered deeply, quietly powerful, gently haunting, as the boy walked forward into a future shaped by this moment. A year had quietly slipped away, carrying with it the echoes of pain and redemption, leaving behind an understated silence that settled over the community like a gentle fog, obscuring yet clarifying, blurring yet sharpening everything it touched. Streets, once simmering with tension, now flowed calmly, the anger and accusations absorbed into the deeper truths carved by time itself. And through it all, Dante Graves walked quietly, steadily, his presence not announced, yet unmistakably felt, as though each measured step subtly reaffirmed his silent yet enduring legacy. The old police headquarters stood solemnly at the corner of the street, the building worn but proud, still bearing the scars of memory and history. Dante passed it without slowing his stride, his eyes lingering only briefly on its facade, a quick, fleeting glance filled not with triumph or bitterness, but simply a quiet acknowledgement of closure, a final nod toward the past. The uniform that had once adorned him was long gone, replaced now by simple clothes that offered no indication of rank or achievement, no outward expression of pride or regret. Dante walked without pause, blending seamlessly with the everyday rhythm of life around him, recognized by no one, acknowledged by none. Yet, inside that building, beyond doors Dante had no intention to reopen, a digital sign glowed softly, illuminating a single carefully chosen phrase. The words were displayed in stark clarity, lit with a cold yet purifying light that drew the gaze of anyone passing through its halls. The message held no name, bore no face, gave no credit. Its power lay solely in the quiet strength of the words themselves. Do not wear a uniform if you cannot bear the weight of the honor it carries. The letters shone gently, a subtle but undeniable beacon, capturing attention not by proclamation but by quiet insistence, softly compelling each reader to pause, reflect, and examine the very nature of their own beliefs. That phrase, powerful in its austerity, had been quietly immortalized, not as a tribute to any single man, but as a lasting principle, a timeless measure by which all who passed beneath its glow could gauge their integrity. There were no plaques of recognition, no commendations offered, nor any heroics openly celebrated. The words alone stood silently, carrying the entirety of Dante's struggle and triumph within their simple elegance. They required no validation, no praise, no public acknowledgement, yet they resonated with profound meaning, speaking volumes in the silent spaces between letters and light. In a cell many miles away, Brent Rawlins continued to serve his sentence, the reality of confinement no longer significant to a community that had moved forward. Rawlins had faded from collective memory, his name now little more than a distant cautionary whisper. The finality of his punishment had ceased to matter, because justice, Dante knew, had never been confined within the bars of a prison, nor limited to a courtroom verdict. Justice lived quietly, powerfully, eternally, in the hearts and minds of those who understood the true meaning of accountability. Dante continued his quiet journey along the sidewalk, passing strangers who moved unknowingly beside him, oblivious to the weighty history he silently carried. There was something deeply satisfying, profoundly peaceful in this quiet anonymity, in knowing he had reshaped the moral landscape not by shouting, but by standing firm in dignified silence, allowing truth itself to speak louder than words ever could. His thoughts drifted gently, carried by the soft breeze that whispered memories and echoed quiet lessons learned. Dante had long realized that true honor required no witness, no external judgment. Its purity remained intact whether praised or unseen, acclaimed or ignored. At a small cafe, he paused momentarily, standing by the window and watching patrons engaged in quiet conversations, sipping coffee, living ordinary lives steeped in simple yet extraordinary freedom. They were unaware of how closely their daily comfort had once come to fracturing beneath the weight of injustice, oblivious to the sacrifices quietly made so they could continue their lives undisturbed. Yet Dante did not resent their ignorance. Rather, he found quiet satisfaction in their peaceful routines, knowing they were a testament to the silent victory he had secured without ever seeking glory. Nearby, a father gently guided his young daughter across the street, holding her hand tenderly as she skipped beside him, carefree and secure. Dante watched with a faint, quiet smile, seeing clearly the future he had worked so silently and tirelessly to protect, a future in which dignity, honor, and justice quietly thrived, no longer requiring constant battles, but living effortlessly within simple acts of kindness, everyday moments filled with gentle humanity. As he resumed his quiet journey, his steps carried him further from the old police headquarters, further from the digital sign whose words had immortalized a truth he had never sought to claim publicly. Yet, within Dante's quiet heart, that same message echoed softly, reaffirming its significance with every measured breath. Honor was indeed a heavy burden, yet one willingly and humbly borne by those strong enough to uphold it, not because they desired accolades, but because integrity demanded no less. The city gradually swallowed him into its ordinary embrace, hiding him amid the gentle hustle of routine. Dante blended effortlessly, willingly, becoming just another quiet figure navigating life's calm currents. Yet, though unnoticed, his quiet strength persisted, felt subtly by those who unknowingly lived in the brighter legacy of his actions. His unspoken influence lived gently yet profoundly in every glance exchanged with dignity, every respectful word shared among strangers, every quiet gesture of courage performed without audience or applause. The words glowing silently in the headquarters building would remain illuminated for years, an ever-present reminder of truths the system had once resisted acknowledging. They quietly proclaimed to all who passed beneath their gentle radiance that Dante Graves had been right all along, not because he said it, but because history itself had affirmed it. forcing the very institutions that once opposed him to silently adopt the standards he had always embodied. Dante needed no monument, required no applause. His victory was not measured in medals or headlines, nor judged by any external authority. Rather, his triumph lived silently, powerfully, within the very principles he had quietly stood for, principles now subtly guiding countless lives through the invisible channels of conscience. And as Dante finally disappeared quietly into the evening crowd, the city continued its gentle rhythm, unaware yet subtly shaped by his quiet legacy. He was remembered in no public celebrations, hailed by no official proclamations, but within the silence he left behind lingered a powerful, unspoken truth, a truth understood deeply by those who recognized that honor was never defined by others' judgments, but solely by the quiet dignity of one's own choices. In that gentle certainty, Dante Graves walked onward, secure in the quiet knowledge that he had done precisely what he had set out to do, not through force or argument, but simply by existing, truthfully, powerfully, and with unyielding integrity. His silent departure left behind no fanfare, yet its reverberations echoed gently, persistently, throughout the city and beyond, a quiet, endless ripple, subtly challenging all who heard it to reflect deeply upon their own beliefs, their own definitions of honor, and their silent battles for justice. Because ultimately Dante understood profoundly that honor needed no validation, required no external affirmation. True honor was quiet, unwavering, and absolute, needing no audience, no judgment, no recognition. It simply existed, powerful and eternal, defined solely by the quiet integrity of one's actions.